Everyone in the small riverside town believed they already understood how the boy's life would unfold, and they believed this long before he ever touched a piano key, because expectations were shaped early and rarely changed in that place, where families were known for generations and futures often followed familiar paths. The boy whose name was Elias grew up in a narrow house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked during heavy rain, and his father worked irregular hours unloading trucks at a warehouse while his mother cleaned rooms at a roadside motel, and from the outside nothing about the family suggested talent or promise beyond survival. Elias was quiet from a very young age, and teachers often mistook his silence for confusion or lack of intelligence, and other children ignored him or mocked him gently at first. And then more openly as years passed. He was small for his age and awkward in movement, and he often seemed lost in thought, as if listening to something no one else could hear. His classmates labeled him slow, and even some adults quietly agreed, telling his parents that he would struggle to keep up, and that expectations should remain modest. At school, Elias sat near the back of the classroom and watched more than he spoke. And when called upon, he answered softly, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, and his hesitation made teachers impatient. They assumed he did not prepare or did not care, and they moved on quickly, leaving him behind. The school had limited resources and little patience for children who did not fit the system, and Elias learned early that blending into the background was safer than drawing attention. His notebooks were messy not because he lacked effort, but because his thoughts moved faster than his hands, and he could not always organize them into neat lines. His grades reflected inconsistency, and by the time he reached middle school, the label of future failure had settled comfortably around him like a coat he never chose but could not remove. At home, Elias spent hours alone because his parents worked long shifts and returned exhausted. And although they loved him deeply, they worried constantly about his future. His father spoke often about practical work and learning a trade, and his mother encouraged him to do his best. But she too feared he would be crushed by a world that rewarded confidence and speed. Neither parent noticed the strange patterns of sound Elias created with household objects, tapping rhythms on tables and counters and listening carefully to the echoes as if studying a language. He did this quietly without realizing it was unusual, because for him sound was comfort and order in a life that felt uncertain. The town itself was not cruel, but it was narrow in vision, and people believed talent announced itself loudly through trophies or confident speech or early success. Elias showed none of these signs, and so he was dismissed without malice. But with certainty, neighbors spoke kindly but vaguely about him, saying he was a nice boy but not much else, and those words followed him everywhere. Teachers stopped pushing him, and peers stopped expecting anything from him, and even Elias began to believe that whatever future awaited him would be small and unnoticed, like the corner desk he occupied year after. Everything about his life seemed predictable until one afternoon, when rain forced him to wait inside the community center after school. The building was old and mostly empty at that hour, and the smell of dust and cleaning solution filled the air. Elias wandered through the halls without purpose, until he heard a sound that made him stop instantly. It was faint and uneven, as if someone were pressing keys, without knowing what they were doing. Yet within the randomness, Elias sensed something familiar, something that spoke directly to the quiet place inside him. He followed the sound to a small room where an old upright piano stood against the wall, its wood scratched and faded, and a woman sat beside it sorting through papers. She noticed Elias hovering at the doorway and smiled politely, asking if he needed something, and he shook his head, unable to explain why he had come. The woman was a volunteer named Margaret who helped organize music classes for children who could afford them, and she had been testing the piano to see if it was still playable. She noticed the way Elias stared at the keys, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if greeting an old friend. She asked him if he liked music, and he nodded, and she invited him closer, encouraging him to press a key. Elias hesitated, because he had learned that touching unfamiliar things often led to trouble, but something stronger than fear pulled him forward. When his finger touched the key, the sound that emerged seemed to settle into his chest perfectly, and for a brief moment, the noise of the world disappeared. Margaret expected him to tap randomly and lose interest, but instead he pressed another key, then another, slowly exploring the relationship between sounds. His movements were careful yet confident, and his face, which usually held a guarded expression, softened into focus. Margaret watched in silence as minutes passed, and Elias began to repeat patterns, adjusting them slightly each time, listening closely and correcting himself without instruction. She felt a chill, because she had seen many beginners, and this was different. There was no searching for approval, no playful banging, just attention and intent, as if he were remembering something rather than learning it. When his parents arrived to pick him up, they found Elias sitting at the piano with Margaret watching nearby, and they apologized immediately, assuming he had caused inconvenience. Margaret stopped them and explained what she had observed, and although she did not make grand claims, she suggested that Elias might have a natural sensitivity to music. His parents exchanged uncertain glances, because this idea did not fit into any plan they had imagined, and yet they could not ignore the calm intensity on their son's face as he played notes that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. That evening at home, Elias said very little about the experience, but inside him something had shifted. The sounds of the piano lingered in his mind, and he replayed them mentally as he lay in bed. And for the first time, his thoughts felt aligned rather than scattered. He did not suddenly believe in miracles or hidden destinies, but he felt a quiet certainty that something important had begun. Even if he could not yet name it, he knew the world still saw him as a boy who would likely flop, who would struggle, would fade into ordinary labor, and he did not yet know how to challenge that belief, but somewhere deep within him, a truth had been awakened, and it waited patiently for the right moment to be revealed. Ilias continued visiting the community center every week, and each visit slowly reshaped how he understood himself, because the piano became a place where his thoughts finally made sense. And instead of feeling scattered, he felt connected, as if his mind and body were finally speaking the same language. And Margaret stayed true to her word by never forcing structure on him, which allowed his confidence to grow naturally without fear of failure. At school, nothing changed on the surface, and teachers still assumed he would fall behind, and classmates still barely noticed him. But inside, Ilias felt different, because he carried a quiet certainty that something within him worked deeply even if the world could not yet see it. And during long lessons, he replayed sounds in his head, and that inner music helped him stay calm and focused. Margaret slowly began to notice patterns in how Ilias played, and she realized that he was not guessing or copying but building sequences based on instinct and memory. And she tested this gently by playing a short phrase and asking him to repeat it. And he did so easily, then altered it slightly in a way that surprised her, because it showed understanding, not imitation. His parents noticed changes at home as well, because Ilias seemed less withdrawn and more settled. And although he still spoke little, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness that had not been there before. And one evening, he asked his father a simple question about how pianos worked, which startled both parents, because it was the first time he had shown clear curiosity about anything outside his routine. Margaret eventually suggested that Ilias try a simple lesson book, not as a test, but as a tool, and he accepted without resistance. And although reading music was challenging at first, he approached it patiently, and his progress came in sudden leaps rather than steady steps, as if understanding arrived all at once after long periods of silent processing. The more time Ilias spent with the piano, the clearer it became that his earlier struggles were not caused by lack of ability, but by a mismatch between how he learned and how the world demanded performance. And this realization quietly reshaped the way Margaret spoke to his parents, because she encouraged them to protect his pace and not rush him toward proof. By the end of that year, Ilias was no longer just exploring sound, but expressing emotion through it. And even though no one outside the community center knew what was happening, something important was forming beneath the surface, and the belief that he would eventually flop began to weaken, not because he had proven anyone wrong yet, but because he was finally beginning to understand his own worth. As the months passed, Ilias' world slowly expanded beyond the small room with the piano and the quiet safety it offered, because Margaret believed that growth required gentle exposure, not sudden pressure. And she began inviting one or two other students to sit in the room, while Ilias played, not to judge or compete, but simply to listen. And at first, the presence of others made his hands tense and his shoulders rise, but he did not stop, and that alone was a change. Ilias noticed that when people listened closely, something shifted in the air, and the sounds he created seemed to reach outward rather than circle back into himself. And this gave him a strange mix of vulnerability and strength, because for the first time his inner world was touching the outside world without being misunderstood. And although he did not look at the listeners, he felt them respond through stillness and attention. One afternoon, a boy his age named Thomas asked him how he learned to play like that, and Ilias struggled to answer because he did not think of it as learning. And after a long pause, he simply said that he listened. And this answer confused Thomas, but Margaret understood and gently explained that everyone listens differently. And some people hear patterns, others hear feelings, and Ilias heard both. At school, subtle changes began to show. Even though no one could name the cause, Ilias raised his head more often, and his eyes no longer dropped to the desk when teachers spoke. And while his grades did not suddenly improve, his focus did, and one teacher noticed that he stayed present longer and followed instructions with greater consistency. And this small shift challenged her assumptions, though she did not yet connect it to anything specific. Ilias' parents were invited to the community center one evening to hear him play, and they arrived nervous and unsure, expecting something simple and perhaps disappointing. But when Ilias sat at the piano and began, his hands moved with calm purpose, and the sounds filled the room in a way that made his mother press her hand to her mouth and his father stand very still, because they were not hearing practice or noise, they were hearing intention. Afterward, no one spoke for a moment, and Ilias felt a familiar fear that silence meant disapproval. But when his father finally spoke, his voice was unsteady, and he said he did not know his son could do that, and it was not praise filled with excitement, but something deeper, like recognition. And that moment settled into Ilias' chest with weight and warmth. From that day forward, his parents began rearranging small parts of their lives to protect this growing space for him. And they worked extra shifts when needed to cover transportation, and they asked questions and listened more even when they did not fully understand. And Ilias sensed that their belief in him was changing, not into blind hope, but into quiet trust. Outside the community center, the town remained unaware, and expectations had not shifted publicly, and people still spoke casually about Ilias' future as if it were already written. But inside him, something steady was taking root, and he no longer absorbed those assumptions as truth because the piano had given him evidence not of greatness, but of capability. And that was enough to keep moving forward. As Elias entered the next school year, the difference in him became harder to ignore even though nothing about his appearance had changed, because confidence showed itself not in volume, but in steadiness, and teachers noticed that he no longer drifted away during lessons, and that when called upon he answered more clearly even if his voice remained soft. And this challenged the long-held belief that he simply could not keep up. Margaret began introducing gentle structure to his piano time by explaining basic theory in simple language, and Elias absorbed it slowly but deeply, asking few questions yet applying concepts with surprising accuracy. And when he struggled, he did not shut down as he once had, but returned to the keys and worked through confusion using sound as his guide. One afternoon, Margaret suggested that Elias perform at a small local gathering organized by the community center, and the idea frightened him because playing alone was one thing, but being watched by strangers felt overwhelming. And for several days he considered refusing, but his parents encouraged him without pressure, telling him that it was his choice, and that they would support him either way. On the day of the gathering, Elias' hands trembled as he approached the piano, and the room felt larger than it actually was. But once he began playing, the familiar alignment returned, and the noise of the room faded, and people who had never noticed him before leaned forward, listening not because they expected brilliance, but because the music held them gently and asked for attention. Afterward, applause filled the room, and although Elias flinched at the sudden sound, he did not retreat. And for the first time, he looked up and saw faces that reflected surprise and respect, and this moment did not transform him into a different person, but it reshaped how he saw his place among others. Word of the performance spread quietly through the town, and while some dismissed it as a pleasant novelty, others began to look at Elias differently, asking polite questions and expressing curiosity. And although the town had not fully rewritten its expectations, the certainty that he would flop began to loosen, and cracks appeared in the assumptions that had followed him since childhood. Elias returned home that evening exhausted but calm, and he understood that the piano was no longer just a private refuge, but a bridge connecting his inner world to the outer one. And while the journey ahead remained uncertain, he now knew that his story was not finished being written, and that knowledge carried him forward with quiet strength. As the weeks passed after the small performance, Elias noticed that people no longer spoke around him as if he were absent, and some greeted him by name and asked how his music was going. And although the attention made him uncomfortable at first, it also helped him understand that he was allowed to take up space without apology. At school, a music teacher who had heard about the performance asked Elias if he would like to try the school piano, and the instrument there was newer and louder, and it intimidated him. But once again the keys grounded him, and the teacher listened carefully, realizing that Elias did not play to impress but to express, and this shifted how she spoke to him, treating him not as a struggling student but as a developing musician. Elias' academic work continued to improve slowly, not because he suddenly became stronger in every subject, but because the confidence he gained from music reduced the constant fear of failure. And when he made mistakes, he no longer saw them as proof of weakness, but as part of learning, and this change allowed him to persist rather than withdraw. Margaret encouraged Elias to begin learning pieces written by other composers, and at first he resisted because he feared losing the freedom he loved. But he soon discovered that interpreting someone else's work was like having a conversation across time, and this expanded his emotional range and taught him discipline without crushing his creativity. His parents noticed that conversations at home changed as well, because they no longer spoke only about survival and bills, but also about plans and possibilities. And although they remained realistic, they allowed themselves to imagine a future where Elias' path might be different from their own, and this hope did not feel reckless but earned. Not everyone in town reacted positively, and a few people suggested that the attention would fade, and that music was not a real path, and these comments still hurt Elias, but they no longer defined him, because he had experienced firsthand the truth of his ability, and that truth remained steady even when doubt returned. By the end of the season, Elias understood that growth was not a sudden leap, but a series of quiet steps taken consistently, and that the piano did not make him special in the way others imagined, but it gave him a voice, and that voice was finally being heard both by others and by himself. As Elias moved deeper into his teenage years, the piano became woven into the rhythm of his daily life, and it no longer felt like something separate or fragile that could disappear, but rather a steady presence that shaped how he understood time, effort, and patience. And this stability began to influence every part of his routine, from how he approached schoolwork to how he handled moments of uncertainty. Margaret began pushing him gently in new ways by asking him to play in unfamiliar settings such as different rooms or with small background noise, because she knew the world would not always offer perfect silence, and Elias struggled at first, feeling distracted and tense. But over time, he learned how to center himself internally rather than rely on ideal conditions, and this skill strengthened his resilience. At school, Elias was invited to join a small music group, and the idea of collaborating frightened him more than performing alone, because it required communication and adjustment, yet once again music became the bridge, and he learned how to listen to others not just to sound, but to intention and emotion, and this helped him connect in ways he had never managed through words. His classmates began to see him not as the quiet boy in the back, but as someone with a presence that carried weight. And while he still did not seek attention, he no longer avoided it, and this balance earned him a subtle respect that surprised even him. There were moments of setback when frustration returned, and progress felt slow, and Elias questioned whether he had peaked too early, but Margaret reminded him that growth often feels invisible from the inside, and that patience was not passive but active, and this reassurance helped him stay grounded. At home, his parents faced new challenges as expectations grew and decisions became more complex, yet they continued to involve Elias in conversations about his future, and this inclusion made him feel trusted rather than managed and strengthened their bond. By the end of that year, Elias understood that the piano had not saved him or transformed him overnight, but it had revealed a truth that had always existed, and that truth gave him direction. And even when the path ahead felt uncertain, he now walked it with intention rather than fear. As Elias' reputation grew quietly within the school and community, new opportunities began to appear, and some of them carried pressure that felt heavier than anything he had faced before because they came with expectations and comparisons and the risk of public judgment. And for a time, Elias struggled with the fear that his value would now be measured only by how well he performed. Margaret noticed the tension in his playing and how his shoulders tightened when he practiced pieces meant for evaluation rather than expression. And she spoke honestly with him, explaining that skill could open doors, but identity should never be trapped inside approval. And this conversation stayed with Elias because it reminded him why the piano had first mattered to him. A regional youth music program invited him to audition, and the idea of competing against students with formal training and confident backgrounds felt overwhelming, and Elias nearly declined. But his parents encouraged him to see the audition not as a test, but as information, and that shift allowed him to prepare without panic. On the day of the audition, Elias waited among dozens of other students, and he noticed their polished clothes and confident chatter. And for a moment, the old belief that he did not belong resurfaced strongly. But when his turn came and he sat at the piano, he returned to the one thing that had always grounded him, which was listening deeply and playing honestly. The judges did not react dramatically, and there was no visible sign of success or failure. And Elias left the room unsure of the outcome, yet strangely calm, because he knew he had played truthfully, and that mattered more to him now than approval. Weeks later, a letter arrived offering him a place in the program with partial support. And although it was not the highest level recognition, it was proof that his ability existed beyond the small town, and this realization expanded his sense of what might be possible. Elias did not celebrate loudly, and he did not suddenly see himself as exceptional, but he allowed himself to accept that the future was no longer fixed, and that the story others had written for him no longer had authority, and this quiet acceptance marked a deeper transformation than any applause ever had. As Elias entered the regional program, his world widened in ways that were both exciting and unsettling, because he was surrounded by students who spoke fluently about technique and competition. Long-term goals, and at first he felt behind not in ability, but in language and confidence. And this brought back old doubts that whispered he had arrived by mistake. The schedule was demanding and the expectations were clear, and Elias struggled with the pace, especially during the early weeks when feedback was direct, and sometimes blunt, and there were days when he returned home exhausted, wondering if the quiet path he had followed before could survive in a louder, more demanding environment. What steadied him was the realization that many of the other students carried their own fears beneath confidence, and that struggle was not a sign of weakness, but part of growth. And once he understood this, Elias stopped comparing himself and focused instead on consistency, showing up, listening carefully, and practicing with intention rather than urgency. One instructor noticed that Elias approached music differently and encouraged him to explore interpretation rather than speed or volume. And this validation did not inflate his ego, but helped him trust his instincts in a setting where it would have been easy to lose them. Slowly, Elias found his place not as the most impressive or the fastest learner, but as someone whose playing carried honesty and emotional clarity, and peers began seeking him out for collaboration not because he dominated, but because he listened and responded thoughtfully. There were moments of frustration when progress felt uneven, and when fatigue threatened his motivation, but each time Elias returned to the simple reason he began, which was that music helped him make sense of the world. And as long as that remained true, he knew he could endure difficulty. By the end of the program year, Elias understood that growth did not erase doubt but taught him how to move forward alongside it. And this understanding prepared him for the next stage of his journey, where the stakes would be higher, and the truth revealed by the piano would be tested in ways he had never imagined. As Elias returned home after completing the program, the town that once felt small now felt familiar rather than limiting, and he noticed how differently he carried himself, not with pride, but with steadiness. And people sensed the change, even if they could not explain it, and conversations shifted from guessing his limits to asking about his plans. At school, administrators invited him to play at a formal event, and this time the audience included people who had once dismissed him entirely. And the pressure was real, but Elias understood now that pressure did not come from expectation alone, but from forgetting why he played, and so he focused on honesty rather than perfection. When he sat at the piano that evening, the room quieted, and he began playing not the most complex piece he knew, but one that reflected his journey. And the sound carried years of patience, confusion, growth, and resilience, and listeners felt something genuine even if they could not name it. After the performance, there was strong applause and open admiration, but what mattered more to Elias was the look on his parents' faces, because it reflected not surprise anymore, but trust and shared belief. And that moment confirmed that the truth revealed by the piano had fully reached the people who mattered most. Opportunities followed, including scholarship conversations and mentorship offers. And while none of them promised certainty, they offered possibility, and Elias learned to evaluate them carefully, choosing alignment over prestige, because he no longer needed external proof to validate his direction. There were still voices that doubted and moments when fear returned, but those voices no longer shaped his choices. And the boy who was once expected to flop now understood that success was not defined by silence or applause, but by living in alignment with his ability. As this chapter closed, Elias did not feel finished or complete, but he felt prepared, and the truth that had once lived quietly inside him was now visible in how he moved through the world, steady, intentional, and unafraid to continue forward. As Elias stepped into the next phase of his life, the noise of prediction no longer followed him, because the story others once told about his limits had lost its power. And he understood that the piano had never been about proving anyone wrong, but about revealing something true that had been hidden beneath misunderstanding and silence. He continued his education with care, choosing paths that respected both discipline and freedom, and there were still challenges, moments of doubt, and days when progress felt slow. But he no longer interpreted struggle as failure, and this mindset allowed him to keep moving forward with patience and clarity. People who met Elias for the first time never guessed the weight of expectation he once carried or how often he had been underestimated, and that no longer mattered to him because his sense of self did not depend on being seen a certain way. And this quiet confidence shaped how he approached every opportunity. The piano remained a constant companion, not as an escape, but as a grounding force, and whenever life felt overwhelming, he returned to the keys, not to hide, but to realign, and this practice kept him honest, connected, and aware of his purpose. His parents watched him with pride that was calm rather than anxious, because they no longer feared for his future, and instead trusted his judgment and resilience, and their support became a partnership rather than protection. Looking back, Elias did not resent the years of doubt or the people who assumed he would flop, because those experiences shaped his patience and empathy and taught him to listen deeply to others just as he listened to music. The truth revealed by the piano was simple and lasting: that ability does not always announce itself loudly, and that growth often begins in quiet, unnoticed moments. And Elias carried this truth with him, not as a lesson, but as a way of living. And as he continued forward, his life no longer followed a story written by others, but unfolded through choices guided by understanding, effort, and trust in his own voice.